started in today's discussion. We've got an agenda to run through here. We've got lots of questions we received beforehand. So just know that if we don't get to your questions throughout the webinar, again, we have our contact information at the end that you can reach out to Marcy or myself or Shauna. So with no further ado, let's get started, Marcy.
And all right. One other thing I'll mention, because I know we always get this question from multiple people in the chat, we will send out a link to this recording to everybody who registered. So you can refer back to it if you have to jump off or you miss a part of it because you have to take a phone call, whatever it might be, or if you want to share it with another board member or committee member or whatnot. So we will send that out, Laura and I, before the end of the week, as well as Marcy's contact information.
Perfect. All right, Marcy, let's get started. Let's talk about our current market of providers and how it looks 10 years back compared to today.
Well, for me, that's actually an interesting question because I started a little over 10 years ago, and I can tell you the changes are tremendous. When I first got into this business, there were like 2 or 3 providers that were available in each market. In some cases, only one. And then that would, change through time. Today, there are probably a dozen really viable, good providers that serve each one of the markets. You have the large companies that we all know are familiar with. And then there are a lot of smaller providers that provide like in different segments, and they all seem to be doing a really good job. There's a lot of competition. The competition has really helped to drive the market in the consumer's favor. So today there's a lot more negotiation available for communities, a lot more that they can get. And also just a lot more that such as infrastructure changes and upgrades to communities that they didn't have before because of all the providers that are now here.
So what are the pros and cons in changing providers right now?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
I said, what are the pros and cons in changing providers in today's market? So, a lot of people have the same provider and they've had it, and they've got all of their original infrastructure.
So that we could spend like the whole hour talking about that. There are so many pros and cons, but the most important thing is when a community is going to market and they're looking for who's going to be their service provider in the future, they want to get the most value for their community, right? So value is a subjective term, right? Value can be best price, it can be highest door fee, it can be best infrastructure. So there's just a lot of things to consider. If the current provider, everything being equal, provides you the same services at the same levels and the same pricing that a new provider will bring, probably easier to stay with the current provider. But in a lot of cases, there are very big variations between what's being offered in the marketplace. So the pros might be that you get a upgraded fiber optic infrastructure if your current provider is not willing to offer that at this moment in time. The pros could be a lower price. It could be better customer service. It's very variable, and it depends on each community and what their needs are and what they're looking for. So there's really no like one fit for each, one fit for all, but there are definitely, definitely benefits, and a lot of people have made changes, a lot of, properties, and a lot of properties choose to stay where they are because they're satisfied, and we just help them get a better program in place.
Shauna, did we see any questions come in right this second that we needed to answer?
Let's see here. Do providers provide reports of usage of their services, cable versus internet, HBO packages, to help inform board decisions? If not, could we request reports, either informal or formal?
Yeah, they absolutely do, especially if you ask for them. The very first thing I do when I'm talking to a property and I'm looking at your agenda, I want to know what the property has now in terms of what kind of contract, when it ends, what's included in it, but also we ask for a penetration report. That's what it's called. And then that will tell us how many people are paying for internet, what speeds are they paying for, how many people are paying for additional services such as HBO or another television package. And the reason you want that is the whole point of this is to craft the new bulk agreement so that it best matches the needs of the community. And you can only know that by having the information that's currently being, purchased.
All right, and so with the current market and providers in the market, who are some of your top 5 fiber internet companies here in Florida that you see?
Okay.
Do you have a few that you're seeing regularly?
So I have my go-to list. I was kind of almost hoping this question didn't come up because I don't want to forget anyone, but I will tell you there are certain providers that I've just had tremendous success with in the market. And I do tend to be very conservative. So I like to go to providers that are here, that have been here for a number of years, that have served a lot of properties, that have done a great job, and where I've gotten really good feedback. So I can tell you, you know, you have the big ones.
If you don't want to give it out now, I can have this, we can have people email you for this list too.
You know, I'm happy to share. Everyone knows the AT&T, the Comcast, the Spectrums, but I've had great success with, you know, other companies, also large companies. There are companies like AdCom or Bluestream or BreezeLine, Hotwire. It's a big one that I've worked with a lot. They, you know, Optical Tel is another provider that I bring in. So those would be like my go-tos, you know, names that people are familiar with. They've done a great job serving the communities here in Florida. And then,
Yeah.
of course, there are probably half a dozen or a dozen others that, you know, are smaller and more regionalized.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about the RFP and bid timeline, best practices. I know as a manager, Sean and I have both been there, that you've got to, you know, dot your I's and cross your T's even before you go out to bid on cable contracts.
Yeah, so this is so funny. I was on a call yesterday with a potential client, and they were telling me that their agreement ends in May of 2025, and they were gonna be looking at what they were gonna do, and they decide a month or two ahead of time. And I was like, you just can't do that, because it takes, if you want to make a change, if you're thinking that you might want to select a different provider, you have to have about a year's time for them to actually do a successful build out. And it takes time to make a decision, right? So you really should be starting that RFP process 2 years ahead of time. And it may seem like a long time ahead, but if you think about the fact that you have to go to multiple providers for bids, you then have to assess the bids, review them with the committees and the boards. Community has to decide what they want to do moving forward. You have to get an agreement in place. It has to go for a legal review. They have to have time, of course, to do permitting, get equipment. This all takes time. So 2 years ahead is ideal. Sometimes we start 2.5, almost 3 years ahead if it's a very big community. And certainly you don't want to be doing this less than, I would say, 18 months ahead of time. But if you do find yourself in the position where it's a year away or 8 months away, then you just have to make sure everyone understands the timeline, the providers, you know, and whoever you're working with, so that you can get it done in time. It certainly can be done, but I would say 2 years is ideal. And then a year for sure, if you can have that amount of time to actually implement, meaning, you know, build out the property so that everyone is ready to go. Now, if you're staying with the same provider, of course, that doesn't really apply, right? Because even if you're going to do a fiber optic upgrade with the same provider, they can certainly upgrade your system with what they have now, and then they can do the build out, you know, over time. So you're not in as big a crunch, you know, as if you were making a change and you have a firm end date for your current
Right.
services.
And a lot of times when you're going out to RFP, you may realize that a provider that you may want to include in your bid doesn't service your area.
Sometimes, and yes, that could happen. And then sometimes the providers will actually come into an area if the opportunity is big enough or important enough, or they're thinking of coming into that area, and this might be a lead in for them. And
They'll
what
make that investment in the infrastructure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like we were working on Logboat Key, and there weren't a lot of choices there. And then the providers were indicated they were interested, and we were able to bring multiple bids to those associations, when before there really had just been one or two, you know, providers there.
That's good to know. All right. So what about Shauna? Any questions? I'm not monitoring.
Yeah,
I'm looking at our.
and I'm trying.
looking at the questions ahead of.
We have a bunch here, so I'm gonna try. And Marcy, if I do any that you know you're gonna review, you're gonna go through, just say, you know, just say so, that we'll review that a little bit later. So
Yeah, we can take them in any order. It's
all
fine.
right, so let's see. What is the relative effort of an existing copper cable provider to upgrade to fiber versus a new provider installing fiber from scratch?
So the very beginning of that question was, what is the benefit to the current provider?
What's the relative effort?
Oh, okay.
So
So look, each provider, whether it's a current provider or a new provider, has to bring in a brand new infrastructure. So if you have a provider now that has a copper or a coax infrastructure, they are not going to be using pieces of that. What they're going to do is bring in a brand new infrastructure. And once that new fiber optic fiber optic infrastructure is in place and being utilized, they will remove the old system. So I think it really is more of a timeline and a satisfaction with your current provider. Certainly, if you have a provider that you like the provider, it is, an easy process to let them go ahead, bring their fiber optics in, and then you're not on a certain timeline and people are familiar with them and it's a transition. But either way, it's really a brand new build out. And that's what I tell people. Don't be afraid of the fiber build out, because all the providers, the ones that currently have the older infrastructures and the new ones that primarily do fiber, they have all got this down. They do a great job. It's a very orderly process. And when they leave, the properties look just as they did when they got there.
Perfect. Oh my goodness, we have so many here.
I know there's a lot of questions. So what, well, while you're looking through questions, Shauna, we'll go ahead to the next agenda item. So as far as deal
And
points to
Laura,
consider,
sorry, just really quick. I have a lot of people who are asking options for very specific areas and neighborhoods. For those, it's probably very hard. Marcy probably doesn't know everything off the top of her head for every area in Florida. So for anybody who's asking very specific things about your neighborhood, your area, we're going to provide Marcy's her contact info. So maybe reach out to her offline and she can chat with you directly and maybe provide you with further info for that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Each market is different, but I can certainly send anyone that requests it a list of the providers that are available for them and maybe some others that might be interested.
Perfect. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
yep, that's a good point to know too, is who might be interested in emerging into that area, that territory. Yep.
Yeah.
So deal points to consider when bidding out bulk contracts. What are key factors that we need to make sure we keep top of mind?
So this is where things have really changed a lot in the last 10 years, right? 10 years ago, people were mostly worried about, price. So if you had someone that was a good negotiator and they were able to get a good price, they sort of did their job. But today, there are so many points to consider and so many things that go along with this. You have not just the price, you have what kind of equipment are you going to get? What kind of TV package, if you have a video package? What are the internet speeds going to be? Are there going to be technology clauses where the internet speeds automatically upgrade, which is very important because these are longer term contracts. You don't want to be stuck in a contract that's going to remain the same for the next 10 years. What the costs are going to be for the infrastructure, what the timeline is going to be for the infrastructure. So typically the fiber optics are at no cost to the community, but there are other things that you want to know. You want to know what the retail packages are going to be outside of just the bulk costs, because you're bringing in this provider and they're going to be the main provider for your community, and they may provide services above and beyond the bulk for your residents. So there are so many different things to consider. Also, whether everyone wants the service, whether everyone's paying for the service now, what they're paying, how much they'll save, what can be negotiated in terms of the number of years. Like sometimes, certain providers will want a length of time and we can possibly shorten that length of time or get free service from them in order to, offset the time they're asking for. Door fees are a big thing I'm asked about all the time. There are huge differences in the door fees that are out there that we see and the incentives that are provided. So I would just say if you're thinking about, or if your community needs, to look at their current, provider or current program or contract, and they're thinking about going to market, talk to someone like me. It doesn't have to be me. Of course, there are other great consultants out there, but get some help because it is not the same as what as what it was the last time maybe that the contract was negotiated. There are multiple things that communities can benefit from. There's free services that could be provided. There's dark fiber that could be brought to perimeters on the property for cameras. There's just no end to the different things that can now be asked for and are very often provided as part of an agreement.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of associations being offered Wi-Fi or internet in common areas, like a little playground area or a tennis court area that will boost their Wi-Fi out there. And those are all part. There's a lot you can ask for in your RFP that you want everybody to bid apples to apples.
Yeah, and that's what we do. What we do is we try to get all of these points covered, and then we put them into a comparative matrix. So we compare them side by side because there are fees that some, providers charge that may not be upfront and may not be realized if you're just looking at a quote. So we are aware of all of those, and we can really give the properties and the boards and committees a really good comparison. And then channel lineups are a big thing. You can think you're paying the same. One property is, one provider's offering $70 the same, another provider's offering that same rate, but maybe there's big differences in what's included in those packages. The equipment or the lineups or pricing for, additional boxes. And these things are all things you have to take into consideration. There's a lot of details today that weren't around, in the past.
10 years ago. Right. Yeah. There's a lot more line items on that RFP. So what about the difference in your channels? So the UHD versus HD and different providers providing UHD for some channels and not all channels. Can you explain the technology behind that?
Sure. So for the most part, the broadcasters are what determine what is available, right? Whether it's available in standard def, high def, ultra high definition. So the providers will, for certain, be out there providing what the broadcasters give to them, because everyone wants to provide the best service, but they need to have that available. So for instance, I think the Olympics that were just held, I think in Paris, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
They were broadcast in ultra high definition by one provider that I know that's done a really good job, and they had the ability to do that because it was broadcast in ultra high def. So there's a lot of things that are happening today. Compression, you have to have the ability and the bandwidth to provide ultra high definition. So that's where honestly fiber optics come in and enhanced infrastructure so that properties can have the ability to receive those services. As technology grows and the need for clarity grows, you have bandwidth requirements that go along with that.
All right.
This is an interesting question, Marcy. Are future internet speed increases built into the long-term contract?
And every contract that I help with, yes, and most of them are, but sometimes, communities don't know to ask for that. So, today, if we did a community and we had a 1 gig speed, we would think, wow, that's phenomenal. And most people won't even need that one or use that 1 gig. But if you're looking at a long-term contract, that may not be so great in 5 years from now. So you do have to build in built-in increases so that communities aren't left behind. There are some providers still that do not put those in their contracts. They just won't. And it's a mistake, but most of the really top providers do have that built in, or else they just automatically upgrade. We all know that, we've had 100 megabits that became 300, that became 500. So a lot of the providers will just automatically pass those along. But you also need to make sure that it's understood that it's there, or else put it in writing.
That was a good question. That kind of leads into our next bullet point here on the agenda: streaming services, and how the impact on cable and internet agreements. I know, Marcy, you and I talked offline about are associations just going to internet only bulk services versus cable and internet? What does that look like?
So from my experience, most of the communities seem to still be wanting to have those video packages or the cable packages. And I think the reason is there's a lot of value in them. So for $30 or $35 or $40, you're getting a lineup that if you were to go and price it out separately would be way more than that. We all know that like YouTube just raised their prices dramatically. It's whenever you buy something in bulk, you're typically buying it at about 60 to 65% or maybe even greater discount off of retail. So, some communities are choosing to go internet only. And again, a strong infrastructure is very important, right? Because streaming requires really good capabilities on the bandwidth side. But I would say today, most communities are still keeping the cable. But again, built into the contracts, there are opt-out periods. Like, you can opt out after several years from the video portion if you want to. I personally don't like to sign communities up to long-term agreements that lock them into certain services. It's always better to have out clauses, and video would be one thing that sometimes you will find, or often you'll find out clauses on, so that if streaming does become even bigger in the future and people don't want that TV package, they'd have the right to drop it as a bulk, drop off.
And are you seeing that in those bulk internet, and streaming contracts, are they including Disney and Netflix and HBO?
So at this time, they're not. I mean, you never know what the future holds. But there are, discounts on all of those. You see package deals where they'll have three of them together for a reduced rate. They're advertised by the providers. Typically, there are channel lineups. They're not streaming services that are offered. And most of the providers have 2 or 3 main tiers of service. So that's another thing when people are looking at their different, providers, they really need to understand the tier of the programming they're buying and what's included and what's obviously important for their residents. I have a survey, and in one of my surveys, we ask, what are the 5 channels that are most important to you? Because you'll find most people tend to watch the same stations over and over.
Yep.
So when I started in this years and years ago, one of my first properties that I did on my own, opted for a certain provider, and that provider did not have Hallmark. And I had to let them know this provider does not have Hallmark, and it changed the course of things because Hallmark was a really important station. It was an over 55 community that would have been very upset with the board if they had removed their Hallmark station. So you do need to know what it is specifically that you're getting with each package. So that goes back to the idea that there's a lot more to this than just getting a price and a door fee,
Yes. Yeah, a whole lot different than it was 10 years ago.
like so different. It's unbelievable. It's amazing how technology has changed and things have changed, but this particular industry has changed a lot. And it's because you have great providers out there, providing fiber optic infrastructure and upgrades to their current infrastructure. There are a lot of upgrades in place today where non-symmetrical speeds, even on the older coaxial wiring, will now be symmetrical in the next year or 2. So across the board, there's a lot of upgrades happening, and technology is evolving for sure.
Yeah, so that kind of goes, oh, go ahead, Shauna.
No,
I know we've got.
Oh, I was gonna, we have tons of questions coming in, so I'm trying to line up. So somebody had asked, AI and fiber, how much speed should we be asking for?
So look, there's a cost to everything, right? Like if you ask a provider to give you a quote for 500 megabits and a gig, the quotes are probably going to be different, right? There is even a 300 tier that some providers will come in at. So it depends on the community. And that kind of goes back to the penetration information that we get early on. Where we ask the current provider, what are people paying for? Because that'll tell you what people need. Usually people will upgrade if they need more. So the standard today probably is between 500 megabits and 1 gig as far as a starting point. There's certainly 600, 700, 800 megabits, but you only need what you're really going to be able to use. So that goes back to the technology clauses. As long as you have clauses in the agreement that will continually upgrade you, I'd much rather see a property pay for 500 megabits today, but know that they're going to be at a gig 3 or 4 years from now, and they didn't have to pay for that gig now, right? So they're saving the money and they're still getting what they need as time goes on. So that's another thing I would tell, people out there now that are looking at an agreement or maybe are pretty far in. Consider asking someone to help you, even if you're pretty far in the process, because there are definitely clauses that we can help make you aware of that could be put in the agreements that will really benefit, speaking to this point of increasing internet speeds, for instance, over time.
Someone also asked, in internet-only contracts, can they include streaming packages?
So today, no. I mean, as far as I'm aware, anyway, internet packages are really specifically for internet. Streaming really refers to the video content. But if you have a strong internet, then obviously you can stream on your own whatever package you might want. So typically, no, streaming services are really not offered on a bulk basis, at least at this time, as far as I'm aware.
There are a ton of questions coming in.
I know.
I know. We can run through the agenda and then we'll just rapid fire it.
Yeah, I think that'll be the best because we have a lot and they're all over the board.
Yeah. So hidden pitfalls in the bulk cable contract. So you brought up a few already, which were, making sure that if there's any improvements in technology or speed that you're automatically upgraded, right? And you
Yeah.
don't have to wait that 10 years or 7 years. So what other pitfalls do you want to watch out for in your bulk contract?
You know, I will say that the providers, at least the ones that I mentioned earlier, that I really do a lot of my business with, they really have good agreements that are very two-sided. You know, this is really a partnership for most of the providers, the good providers out there. They're not looking at this as a one-sided contract. They want an ongoing partnership with the property, right? They want that same association to want to remain their client for a long time because they're putting a big investment into the property. Even if they're on the same infrastructure, they still have boxes and equipment and things that have to be added in, you know, to a property. So there really aren't that many pitfalls. You just have to make sure that you have the right things negotiated for. So I don't think it's as much of a pitfall as maybe not having the right things like a speed increase is negotiated for beforehand, or maybe some set pricing for the phone service beforehand. So it's more about things that might be left out. And I will say in Florida, we have some of the finest HOA attorneys. I know personally know a lot of them, but these attorneys, especially ones that, you know, are well-known that work on these contracts, they know what to look for. So they will help protect. I know like SLA language was one of the questions. These are things you really have to rely heavily on your legal counsel for, because they know how to make sure that the communities are protected and they don't have pitfalls, you know, in the agreements that they're signing.
Right, we had a question come in beforehand. It says, how many times per year can you put Comcast on a seasonal rate for those of us not in home year round? Does that apply with bulk contracts? I know.
No, so it really doesn't. With a bulk contract, that service is provided 12 months of the year, right? You're getting a very big discount for paying for all the residents full time. However, people can put their additional services on hold. And I think it's for a total of 6 months. I believe you can put it on hold and take it off hold several times, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'll get back to you with an answer on whoever had that question. But for the bulk portion, no, it cannot be put on hold. It's going to be there all year. But that actually speaks to an interesting point, if you want me to just elaborate.
Yeah.
Okay, one of the biggest things when I did start 10 years ago were people were saying, well, you know what, I'm not here, I'm only here 6 months of the year. And I'm back in New York 6 months of the year, so I'm paying for my cable 12 months. You know, why do I want to do that? Well, today, all these services are portable, right? Meaning you can watch your shows in New York when you go in for your 6 months. There are workarounds, there's Fire Sticks, there's apps that you can go on. You can download an app to your television and watch a lot of your content that you're paying for here in Florida. So that portability is one factor that really makes bulk contracts more valuable. I have so many of my clients that tell me they went back to another location, they canceled their cable service, and they were using their discounted bulk cable service from Florida in their second home or third home as well. So that's one factor. And then on the internet side, you know, people, if they do leave, and there are a lot of people that come and go from Florida, right? Like with that snowbird question, they have great technology in their home, right? They may have a toilet with a water, you know, system that will let them know if something's wrong, or a Ring doorbell, or a, you know, refrigerator that has Wi-Fi. So that Wi-Fi being on year round, not being turned off, is also a great benefit to those folks that may have a camera. They want to see what's happening in their home or around their home when they're not here. So all of these services, both the video and the internet, are now really being used much more on a full-time 12-month basis, even for people that aren't here, either because of the portability or the technology in the homes that requires the internet to be on.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that.
And
And what do you think about as far as the length and term of the bulk contract? I've seen 7 years, 10 years. What do you lean towards?
You know, the funny thing is, I guess everyone wants the shortest term because people are afraid, you know, of a commitment, right? But a lot of times the longer term agreements, when they end, are actually paying a lot less than people that started, you know, did a 5-year and then another 5-year, because rates, you know, are all over the place. But I will say that in general, you want to negotiate for the shortest time you can. That gives you a reasonable return, right? Because these providers, especially if they're putting in new infrastructures, they have to get a return on their investment. And they want to provide the services at the lowest possible rate, you know, to make the associations happy. So I don't really see anything wrong with a longer term agreement, a 10-year agreement, let's say. as long as the right deal points are built into the contract, right? As long as there's no pitfalls. If you
Yep.
can, change your services or upgrade your services as needed, if the internet speeds are gonna keep increasing as needed,
Mhm.
then really what's the harm? Get the lowest price, make sure you do a really good job vetting your provider so that you're happy with the selection. And I would say one of the best things for the communities doing this today there are a lot of providers that have been doing this for quite some time and doing it really well. So you'll be able to have a lot of referrals, a lot of people you can speak to before you get into that long-term commitment so that you can feel more comfortable that you're, partnering with a good provider. So
Right.
It's return on investment, but it's also making the right selection up front.
Right, and going back to what's in the actual contract. And that
Yes.
leads into one of the questions we received ahead of time as well was, how do the cable companies give associations thousands of dollars back and still make a profit? And when they say they're gonna invest into your company or your association.
Yeah, so you're talking about door fees, I'm assuming, right? They give you
Yep.
this upfront door fee and then they're wondering how do they do that? Look, they have their return on investment, right? So when they go into a community or do an agreement with a community, they're not just thinking about those bulk years, they're thinking long-term, right? They want to be a partner in providing service to that community over a long period of time. So they do their calculations and they figure out what they can afford to do and still, make a profit. And sometimes that profit is not in the early years of the agreement. Very often it's not. They may not make a profit until the very end of the agreement. But again, they're thinking long-term. So
Right.
that's the way that they can do it. And forget the door fee. What about the infrastructure? If they're bringing in upgraded infrastructure or upgraded equipment, routers, boxes, those all have big costs involved as well, sometimes much more than a door fee. So,
Right.
always try to get the most that you can and the lowest rate you can and the best services you can, but understand that it's a package and you want to, make sure that it's balanced, that you're not getting a door fee that's going to greatly, increase your rate, for instance. And that's something that people, that do this for a living know, because we know what all the properties are getting, and you probably know a lot as well, managing
Yeah.
a bunch of properties.
Yeah. So that goes to our next bullet point. So what is the average cost savings for bulk cable contracts versus everyone saying it on their own individual plan?
So there are several benefits and savings, right? So the easiest answer is a bulk contract is usually about 65%, could be 70%, could be a little more, a little less off of what retail is, right? So if you had someone buying a $100 TV package, they might be able to get it for $35 on a bulk. So there's a big savings. And now that it's portable, it really makes it feasible because people, again, can use it all year round. But there are other things you have to look at. I mean, for instance, there are additional services that some of these providers have, whether it's cell phone service. So again, if you're part of a bulk, you might have options to opt into a cell phone program with that provider. There may be discounts on other services that they have. You might have a discounted phone from them if you use a home phone. So there's a lot of savings that are not just specific to that bulk contract.
Well, yeah, it's just back in the day, Comcast didn't offer cell phone service. Now they have Xfinity cell phone service. AT&T wasn't offering cable; they were only offering cell. Now they offer both. So that's where you're opening my eyes up to more of how many players are in the field and how much all of them offer. Versus it seems like everybody used to have their own lane, and now they're involved in all. Yeah.
And that brings up something else, like a lot of the providers will provide a lot of services that people are paying for today, right? So if they're paying for, security cameras or internet in their clubhouse or different items that, are coming out of their budget, the association's budget, and a provider comes in and takes away that cost, that's a savings as well. So sometimes we'll look at like the overall savings on the general community-wide services, and that might lower the price by even a few dollars when you factor it out. So that's why it's really important to lay these things out side by side and look at the whole package versus just what the rate is, let's say, or what the door fee is.
Right. All right. Factors that determine what new infrastructure is needed in a community. So I know a lot of associations may have been with the same provider for the last 10 years. They have fiber, that fiber was installed. When does that fiber need to be replaced or upgraded?
Yeah. So the bigger question really in South Florida is maybe they have older coax in the ground, right? If they have a fiber optic infrastructure that was put in the last 10 years, even 20 years, there are different systems that were deployed. Like 20 years ago in my community, Savannah, which you guys manage, was
Yeah.
built. We had a node plus zero about 10 years ago. We had a node plus zero overbuild. So there was fiber brought to nodes throughout the community. And then we still have the coax running, from those nodes to the homes. More recently, anyone that's been built out the last few years probably had a fiber to the home build out, which means fiber is already brought directly into each home. So those
Right.
communities, they're good for a long time, certainly, but a lot of Florida has older coax systems, and that's why they don't have symmetrical internet speeds. So you'll see internet speeds sometimes of 500 over 10 or 20. And that is being remedied. The big providers are coming in and they are having workarounds. There's a Project Genesis going on now, for instance, with Comcast, where they're going to be upgrading their upload speeds so that their internet will be more reliable, which not that it's not reliable now, but it's going to be enhanced for sure in the next coming years. But I think that most of the older properties that I call on, a lot of them are 30, 40 years old. They have had, cuts in the wiring, or
Mhm.
it's just older, it's corroded. A lot of those really need to look at what they should do with the infrastructure. And I like to say, if it's working great, it's working great, right? It doesn't really matter how old it is, but if there's problems, then you need to address, looking at other infrastructure upgrades, whether it's a full fiber build or just running some new coax wiring, to the buildings or to the homes. You have to really look at each individual association separately and see what their needs are. And very often you can tell by trouble calls, or you can tell by talking to the board about their own experiences. But really, it's just about finding the best balance for each community as to what they need, what they want, and what's working well for them now, and what they might, feel they need to improve upon.
Right. Oh, there you go. All right, let's see. One of our questions that came in was, are we going away from cable? You said cable coax. So forgive me for my ignorances, but you've got cable coax and you've got fiber.
So there's two parts to that question. The first part is, are we going away from cable, meaning like actually TV
Ex-
services being bought? We talked about that earlier. Yes, I mean, streaming is becoming more important, but communities are still wanting that bulk cable. What I think you're referring to, though, is the actual coax in the ground
Yep.
versus fiber. I think that there is a trend to wanting to upgrade to fiber optics. If you had a property that was being built today, inevitably it would be built with fiber all the way into the home. That is pretty typical today. But again, there are a lot of communities that decide to either stay with their current provider and do a fiber build out with that provider, or look at the options in the market and potentially go to another provider. And then there are, properties that I speak to every day that are just very happy. They feel their services work really well, and they want to wait and see what upgrades, may happen. But I would say yes. I mean, there's a chart, and I can send it to you. I actually really meant to send it to you ahead of time. That really shows the trend toward fiber optics, and that trend is very real. I think they were
Okay.
saying something like there's going to be 60 or 70% of Florida is going to have fiber optics by the end of the decade. I'm not sure that's an exact correct quote, but it is definitely the way of the future. And it future-proofs the community too, because it's not going to be good for just today or tomorrow. It should hopefully be good for the next 20 years or more.
Well, if you want to send me that chart, I can include it in our email when we follow up with everyone that attended our webinar.
I
That'd be
will,
great.
and I want to see if there's an updated one, because the one I'm thinking about actually, now that I'm saying that, was about a year ago, and that probably has changed and even increased in terms of the number of homes that are going for fiber transitions. I will find that.
All right, and so we're going to wrap up with our last bullet point, and then we're going to go through a lot of questions.
Okay.
The benefits of working with a cable consultant. I know through everything you've just said, you've just lined out or outlined really a lot of items that, again, I haven't bid out a cable contract myself in 8 years, and there's a lot of variables that are, things that I would need to include on that RFP for sure. So you've
Yeah.
opened my eyes to that, but talk about the benefits of working with a cable consultant, and if there's different phases where, a lot of board members have done the majority of the work, or they came from that specialty and they know, the market for the most part, or maybe it's slightly different here in Florida? Are you willing to work at different capacities?
No, absolutely. Actually, my favorite thing is to come in after a board or committee has gotten proposals, because then I can clearly show typically that I can get a better proposal or include extra value, added value that maybe wasn't there before. I would say for the most part, the cable consulting fees predominantly come from the providers. It's almost like a marketing fee. When I worked for Comcast, it didn't matter how much, if a cable consultant was involved or not. Their fees were their fees, but knowing how to negotiate them was very helpful. What I would say is any community that's thinking of an infrastructure upgrade for sure really needs to have a consultant involved, because there are different systems, there are different deployments. There's going to be a transition. It's very helpful to have someone that's gone through that multiple times before. And then as far as like the actual negotiating, it's really hard to negotiate what you don't know, right? So you can't have any idea what the lowest rate is. I myself have been fortunate to work with some of the largest associations in Florida. I've worked on properties that were 7,000 units and up. So, when you work on properties that are that big, you really know how low the rates can go and what incentives can be included. And a good consultant will try to bring every benefit available to their association, even if it's a small association. Because, as a consultant, we work with a lot of properties, so we're able to sometimes get portfolio pricing or added benefits, or just the knowledge of what is out there can be extremely important. It's like you could be sitting on a plane and have paid $200 and feel like you got a great price, and then find out the person next to you paid 150, and now you don't feel as good about that purchase. We want to make sure a good consultant will make sure you have really the best deal in the marketplace at that moment in time. And times change, but every moment counts, and you want to really work to the benefit of the residents. You have to think beyond just a cable agreement and what is going to be best for the whole property, within that agreement and outside of the agreement too.
Yeah. And Marcy, a number of people have asked, of course, elephant in the room, how would the cable consultant, like your services, how does that structure work as far as how you get paid, right? Like, does the association cover that cost, or do you get your kind of fees from the cable company? How does that work? Like that?
Sure. It's changed and evolved over the last number of years too. Typically, when I started in this industry, the average cable consultant would make 20 to 25%, more likely 25% of the door fee. That would be how they would get paid. So we would negotiate really hard, to get a good door fee so that the property received as much money as if we weren't involved, right? Because, we would know what was out there, and we'd be able to ask for the highest amount possible. In recent years, a lot of the providers have started to pay just a set direct fee to sort of take that out of the equation, and it does not come out of the property's money. So in the great majority of the cases, my services are at no cost to the association. There are some cases with AT&T, Frontier, that we still have to operate on that 25%, but across the board, for the most part, there's no direct fee to the property. They just know that we're getting compensated. And here's the best part. It doesn't matter who they select. As long as we know that we're going to have our fee covered, we want what's best for the property. We're not looking out, at least I'm not looking out for myself. What I'm looking out for is what is the best scenario for the property. And very often taking that door fee out helps, because there are some board members that just feel that they don't want to have to pay someone for help. They really want the help, but they want to show that they could do it themselves. And very often it's, it's not the best case for them. I had, and I understand it, because people want to do the best they can. If they're on the board, they're working really hard and they want to do the best they can for the association, and they don't want to look like they spent money they shouldn't have, or gave away money they didn't have to. But I had a pretty decent sized association, that I was kind of working with, but then they went off, they did it on their own. And that person left the community, actually picked up and went back to New York to be with family. And I got a call like a week later, hey, now we want your help. Well, they had already signed their agreement. So, and there were things in the agreement I would have changed for sure. And I think I could have done a better job for them. So, there are a lot of benefits and very few drawbacks if you hire a good consulting firm to help you. And remember, at the end of the day, it's always your decision. Consultants don't make any decisions for the boards. The boards make the decision based on having enough quality information to make the best decision possible for their association. So that's really important to remember too.
That's the key. That's the key. All right, are you ready to rapid fire, Marcy, on some questions? Some are duped.
Sure.
Shauna, we can kind of tag team these
Yep.
and get through them. I see there's two questions specifically about 5G and will 5G be a competitive technology of the future for home internet services versus bulk cable companies?
Well, 5G and fiber are fundamentally different and they serve different roles. 5G is based on a mobile wireless communication technology. It's, like if you want to have a self-driving car, you need to have a strong 5G system in place. Fiber is really brought into a specific location like your home or office, and it has greater bandwidth capacity. So again, today we need a gig or half a gig to get by, but in the future you may need a lot more, and a fiber optic infrastructure can provide a dedicated 10 gig, infrastructure for a property. So they both have different uses, but remember that 5G is primarily cell technology, and it is a little bit different. Can provide some of the same services, but again, has different main purposes. They're more for as you're going around, out and about versus being in your home. Although certainly I'm not saying they can't work in the home, but it just depends on how much capacity you need. If you have 100, devices or 50 devices, you may not get the quality of service you'd want without a fiber or a direct connection through coax.
Somebody had a question regarding leaving like one bulk contract, completing one bulk contract, and if you go into a new bulk contract with a different company, can they come in and run the lines? How does that work, that transition?
That actually takes me back to your pitfall question, because that is probably the one pitfall that I do sometimes see. Sometimes a provider will ask you not to engage with another provider until 60 days before the end of their agreement, right? And you can't agree to that, because you need to be able to start this process 2 years ahead of time. So if you have an agreement, let's say with provider A, and you're interested in talking to provider B, C, and D, you need to be able to talk to those separate providers 2 years ahead of time in order to have a smooth transition, because you need that time frame. So again, you have to be doing this ahead of time. You have to have everything ready ahead of time, but that bulk agreement can't start. And that's the key. And that's what I tell people to put in the agreement, that the actual new bulk agreement can be negotiated, can be looked at, prior, and you have to leave yourself again enough time, but that it would not start or begin until the end of the current bulk agreement, because they are in a, legal obligation to their current provider.
Neil, this is maybe Shauna and I can help answer this as well. How can the HOA negotiate bulk cable internet contracts on behalf of the community when the actual customers are the residents? Witness infringe on customer choice. So depending on what your documents say, if it's included in your HOA fees or condo fees, and that's part of it, then the board would have the authority to negotiate that contract. But the best way to do that is to also get a pulse from the community, like Marcy was saying, is putting out a survey. What are their top? So you're not going to be able to service, make everybody 100% happy, but you can give everybody their top 3 channels, because everybody's top 5 and maybe the top 3 are the same, and then everybody can increase their services from that. So the association pays for a baseline, if you will, and then everybody can add to that. If they want the sports channel or golf channel, they can get it, or NFL. But the association's not going to pay for all the specific channels. Is that a good enough answer, team?
And it's similar to like, for example, if you live in a maintenance-free community, the associate or the board is negotiating and picking the landscape company, right? Even though they're servicing every customer in their yard in the community, so yeah, there are certain things, obviously, depending on your docs, as Laura said. So I'm going to combine a couple of different questions here just to make it a little easier. So one person is asking, how do we, or if we don't currently have a bulk contract, where do we start and how do you sell the idea on 731 homeowners in this example? We also had some people asking about their owners, they're not necessarily on the board, and how do you convince your board to look into, a bulk cable agreement? So I'll give you
I
a
get
couple
this
there.
question all the time, by the way. I literally probably get a call a week with someone saying, I live in a community and why can't we have bulk and how much would it be? Or a contact from a board member, a committee member saying, we are looking at this. And the reason is, especially I think on the internet side today, pretty much most people use internet, you know, the great majority. You could say on the TV side, you're right, people do have different services that they like. My husband only uses YouTube. Wouldn't matter what cable service I gave him, he just watches YouTube 24/7. But on the internet side, people need internet, right? So again, people like to have choice. That's a great thing. And certainly there are people that will want to use a different service. But if you have the great majority, and this is where the penetration information would come in. So if I had a property call me or reach out, the first thing I would do if they gave me the ability to do so by signing what's called an LOA, a letter of authorization, just to get information and potential bids. It doesn't obligate them to anything, just to be clear. But the first thing I do is ask for penetration information, because let's say that someone calls from a community and we do a quick penetration check and we see that 90% of their people are paying for internet and they're paying an average of $65 plus most of them are renting a router, which is another fee. How wonderful to be able to go to the community and say, guess what? We can get this for you for $30 or $35 and save everyone so much money, you know, on their monthly fee or their monthly cost. And then sometimes it's not a very difficult process. I mean, sometimes certainly it is, depends on the community. But we've had communities that we have taken from being complete retail, where, as you said, everyone paid for their own, to a bulk program. And most of the time, the community is very grateful for the savings. The residents are
Yep.
very pleased by it, especially when you have a community that predominantly uses one provider. Because then you're not really changing anything for people, you're just lowering their bill dramatically.
That actually
know-
leads, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
You can
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say that I saw another question earlier. I have to find it again, but somebody did ask, can you have contracts with multiple providers?
So not typically in a bulk scenario, because bulk is typically the whole community. There are some cases where the provider, depending on the size of the community and the circumstance, will do a partial bulk, meaning like they'll let a certain amount of people, you know, confirm that they want the service and the rest can do what they want. But they certainly, I've never seen where there are more than one bulk contract. Unless in some cases, if it's a very old satellite TV only service, and in those cases, you can sometimes have a bulk internet that will partner with that. But certainly the providers going in today, putting in that infrastructure, making that investment, they want to make certain that, you know, that you're not giving a big portion of your business away to someone else.
Gosh, there's so many questions.
I know.
And some of these, yeah, and Marcy, if you don't know the answer, this is specific about customer service with different installers. Is this something you want to take?
I'm happy to answer a customer service
Okay.
question.
This is to you, Marcy. Can you comment as to the customer service experience after the install and going forward, comparing the larger companies such as Spectrum versus the smaller companies like Bluestream or Hotwire? Thank you. That's from
Sure.
Ira.
So that is a loaded question, but I will say that the big providers like the Spectrums, the Comcast, they have gotten a lot better at customer service, but certainly Bluestream, Hotwire, which are the two you mentioned, those are companies that do an amazing job of taking care of their you know, residents. And that's part of the reason why I do bring both those companies into pretty much every bid that I'm doing. So, you know, when you have a smaller company, and I'm not saying these companies are small because they service a lot of properties, but their focus, you know, is their employee ratio to the resident is obviously going to be different as well. They have people that are really on staff that are there to make sure that transition happens smoothly, that the properties are happy, so that they then refer them out to other properties. So it's kind of, you know, just almost common sense that there's going to be a lot more hand holding, right, when there's a transition, but also customer service is a big win with, you know, with those companies that I have found. And I have been very pleased with both of them and with others that I mentioned earlier in terms of really having happy associations, which is a great thing, because that's what you want.
That is a good thing.
Yeah.
All right. Do you see any specific, did you have a question on top of mind, Shauna?
Yeah, someone was asking about communities adding cameras, like security cameras in their bundles, and is there an average cost involved?
So some of the providers will go a step further and actually include some camera systems. But typically what those properties need is they need the fiber drops to those locations so that they have a way to, set up their system. And all the providers coming in certainly will very often do dark fiber drops for communities. So if I'm working with a new community and they are looking like they're going to be doing a fiber rebuild, I suggest that they wait and include, where they want those security cameras to be located to see if we can get those drops included so they don't have any infrastructure charges in setting them up. And then very often they'll go to a separate security company, but they'll have in place what they need. So the big cost, of setting up the infrastructure is taken care of at no cost typically.
Couple contract questions. Do the providers typically provide the technical upgrades at no cost to the community during the term? So if you have the language that speaks that they will improve your infrastructure or the tech, as far as your gigabytes that you get as we advance in technology, are they going to increase your cost when they do that?
So almost always there's no cost increase. I really have never done one that I can think of where there was a built-in cost increase. So what happens is you're negotiating today, let's say for 500 megabits, but these companies all want you to have good service. They don't want service calls. They don't want problems. They don't want pixelation. So they either build into the agreement or else that's just their standard business practice of continuing to upgrade the speeds as they become needed. And that will almost 100% of the time happen without any additional cost to the community. Again, in some cases, you want to build it right into the contract. In other cases, like with Comcast, for example, they just have been routinely upgrading their speeds, on a regular basis. And people have seen that, so they feel more comfortable when that's not called out specifically. But yes,
Right.
you want to make sure that there are continual speed increases throughout an agreement that come to the property as needed without extra charge.
I had a number of questions. I know we touched on the switching out of lines briefly before, but I don't know, and I apologize if we did. I don't recall if we touched on this specifically, but a couple of questions about who owns the equipment and the lines when the contract is done.
So typically the provider owns the fiber or the coax that it's on the property going into the building. The home run wiring, which runs into each unit, sometimes can belong to the condominium. Sometimes it remains with the provider, but the in-home wiring is almost always belongs to always belongs to the unit owner. So the wiring inside your condo or your home is yours. The wiring going to your home typically, for the most part, belongs to the provider. And that was kind of part of, just to share with you, I'm sorry, but that was kind of part of that, return on investment that we spoke about earlier. They want to serve your community, hopefully in a bulk. Most of them prefer that, but they want to be able to serve long-term. So they need to have and maintain that wiring so they can continue to serve the residents.
Perfect. We have a manager asking, would you work with an HOA for an hourly rate?
I don't think so. And the only reason is I will work for free. If that manager wants to call me and ask me a question for an hour, I will give them an hour of my time as a courtesy, especially if it's a management company I've worked with before. The only reason I really wouldn't want to do it on an hourly rate is, number one, most of the time they don't have to pay me anything because the provider will pay. But this is an ongoing process, so I could get them to a point or negotiate one thing for them or give them some advice. They could take it and absolutely not end up with where I would have wanted them to be. And then my name might be associated, with it. So I want to make sure my properties all have the best agreements in place across the board.
All right. I see a question. It says a previous complex had a 2-year agreement with a local cable company. They thought the prices were fixed for 2 years. However, the cable company added additional fees that were not taxed. How do you avoid this?
So you want to make sure in your agreements that you have capped increases, meaning you don't have open-ended charges that can be included, like broadcast fees. So that's a big one, Mike. As the broadcasters are increasing their fees to the providers, right? sometimes they want to try to pass that along. So you have to be very careful. That could be another pitfall. It's not really seen that much today, but it could happen. Where in an agreement, it allows the provider to pass along, charges that are in addition to the negotiated yearly increase. And that's when that happens. So you want to avoid it by, number one, negotiating to make sure you're getting a capped rate, and number two, having a good attorney look at your agreement. Or, or a consultant, or obviously an attorney needs to do the legal part to make sure that there isn't language there that, that changes that equation.
This is an interesting question. For condo buildings, are all units sharing and competing for the same bandwidth, or is each unit separate or governed so that one unit can't overconsume and severely impact other units?
So not even specific to condos, but on a coaxial system where there's shared, infrastructure, there are times people have told me, when the kids come home at 3 o'clock and everyone jumps on the internet, it slows down. So those are typically shared systems where you don't have a dedicated bandwidth to each home. What fiber does is it actually brings a dedicated bandwidth into each property or into each personal home, whether it's a condo or a house. So in that case, no, you wouldn't have it shared. Everyone would have their specific amount of bandwidth or speed that they've negotiated for. Sometimes in a condo, it probably is possible if they're all sharing, or going on at the same time, that services could be a little slower. But even so, if you're in a bulk agreement, those services should match what you're paying for. It's like if you're paying for 300 megabits, everyone should be getting 300 megabits or there's a problem.
Sorry, I'm just trying to read through all of our questions. If we don't get to your question, again, it's 12:04, just out of respect for time. You see Marcy's contact information here, her email, her phone number. You can email her directly. You can email us. We'll be happy to help you. Shauna and I are happy to help you as well.